The moment Greater Manchester Police raid a lockup as they execute an arrest warrant. In the heart of Greater Manchester, a gang of criminals were preparing for what they believed would be the perfect job. This wasn't a robbery or a drug deal, it was a kidnapping. Their target? A man they believed was a major underworld player sitting on cash and cocaine. Disguised as plainclothes police officers, they snatched him off the street in broad daylight and vanished. What followed was a 13-hour ordeal involving tasers, blowtorches, and a £500,000 ransom demand. The plan was ruthless and professional until it wasn't. One mistake, one call to the real police, and the entire operation began to unravel. 8 men, 1 victim, and a trail of brutality that led straight back to betrayal, greed, and the illusion of power. They thought they'd found the perfect mark. Instead, they exposed themselves. He wasn't just someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man at the center of this kidnap plot was, by all accounts, a known face in certain circles. Someone who lived on the edges of legality, skirting between business, reputation, and rumor. The gang didn't stumble across him by chance. He was selected and watched. They believed he had what they wanted: money, drugs, influence, and crucially, they believed he wouldn't dare go to the police. That assumption was based on more than just gossip. The victim's history painted a picture of someone with deep roots in the underworld. He'd been linked to drug operations before, had brushes with law enforcement, and was known to keep a low profile despite clearly living well. Expensive clothes, high-end cars, unregistered phones. It all pointed to someone earning big and keeping it quiet. The kind of person who handled things in-house, without outside interference. But what made him especially vulnerable was his routine. He had grown comfortable, perhaps even careless. He played weekly football matches, often with the same faces. He visited local restaurants without switching up his patterns. He returned to the same barber shop. These habits gave the gang exactly what they needed: predictability. Sean Freeman exploited that predictability. A long-time acquaintance of the victim, Freeman was a familiar and trusted face. No one would think twice about seeing the two together. He used that trust to gather information, slowly building a dossier. Vehicle registrations, addresses, names of relatives. He played the role perfectly. Friendly, loyal, just another lad in the circle. But all the while, he was feeding the gang everything they needed to strike. The victim may have sensed something was off. He moved like someone watching his back, never lingering too long, always alert. But when betrayal comes from inside your own circle, even the most streetwise can be caught off guard. In this case, it wasn't just the streets that betrayed him. It was someone he called a mate. April 11th, 2019. The day everything snapped into motion. After weeks of watching, planning, and laying the groundwork, the gang activated their plan. The target, unaware he'd been under close surveillance, had just left Snip's Barbers in Hale, fresh trim, relaxed, walking straight into a trap. Waiting for him were Daniel Lowe, Ben Ukaegbu, and John Bishop. They didn't need uniforms. The plainclothes look gave them just enough credibility. Confident, composed, and armed with fake authority, they told him he was being arrested on suspicion of Class A drug offences. He didn't argue. No shouting, no running. He'd been through arrests before, and this felt routine. Another stop, another case to deal with. They cuffed him and walked him over to a black Audi A6 parked nearby, its number plates cloned to avoid suspicion. To bystanders, it looked like a quiet, professional takedown, nothing dramatic, but what followed was anything but standard. Instead of heading to a police station, the Audi weaved through a series of back streets before coming to a halt in a quiet alley in Gorton. That's where the mask dropped, literally and figuratively. As the car stopped, Micah Walfall was already in position. The moment the victim stepped out, he was grabbed, a hood was yanked over his head, and the cold metal of a gun. An imitation, but close enough to be convincing, pressed into the side of his skull. There was no chance to protest, no time to process. Within seconds, he was bundled into a VW transporter parked nearby, and the Audi sped off. No sirens, no paperwork, just silence, confusion, and brute force. The van didn't have flashing lights or a custody cage. It had one purpose: transportation to a hidden site where the real ordeal would begin. Everything had been set up in advance. The vehicle was in place. The safe house was prepped. The route had been mapped and timed. The goal was to make it look seamless, to disorient him so quickly and completely that resistance felt pointless. And it worked. Within minutes, the victim had gone from casually leaving a barbershop to being a hostage in a van with no clue where he was being taken or what would come next. Inside the Gorton lockup, time stopped. The walls were bare, cold, industrial, nothing more than concrete and metal, echoing with every scream and demand. No windows, no natural light, no witnesses, just one man, bound and broken, surrounded by people who were convinced he was sitting on a gold mine. For the next 13 hours, his world collapsed into a haze of pain, fear, and confusion. The orders came quickly, barked out like they were routine. £100,000 in cash. Another £400,000 in cocaine and heroin. The gang didn't see this as a request. It was a transaction they expected to be completed. They were certain the victim had access to that kind of money. After all, in their minds, he was no ordinary target. They saw him as a well-connected player in the drug world, someone who could snap his fingers and have £500,000 in his lap by nightfall. But when he failed to deliver, things turned brutal. He was tasered repeatedly in the groin, the jolts of electricity deliberately targeted to maximize pain. His arm was burned with a blowtorch, skin blistering as he screamed through clenched teeth. They showed him a firearm, imitation but hyper-realistic, and pressed the barrel to his head. He didn't know it was fake. In that moment, it may as well have been the real thing. The threat wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Each act of violence was methodical, spaced between new ultimatums. You've got an hour, make the call, find the money, or it gets worse. And it did. The gang phoned his family using burner phones, disguising their voices, making the stakes clear. They demanded the ransom be delivered to Birmingham. No police, no stalling, just cash, and fast. For the victim's loved ones, the call was like being dropped into a nightmare. They didn't know if it was a bluff, a scam, or something more sinister, but the fear in that call was unmistakable. And instead of folding, they acted. Quietly, urgently. They called Greater Manchester Police. Back in the lockup, the air was thick with dread. The victim, bruised and semi-conscious, drifted in and out of lucidity. Every sound felt like a threat. The gang around him felt confident, almost relaxed. They believed they were in total control, convinced the victim's silence and the family's fear would buy them time. But what they hadn't accounted for was that help was already on the way. By the time Greater Manchester Police fully understood the scale of what they were dealing with, the victim had already endured hours of torture inside a locked, windowless unit in Gorton. But the gang had miscalculated. They thought fear would do the work for them. They assumed the victim's criminal background would silence his family, that no one would risk involving the authorities. But the opposite happened. The second the ransom demand was made, alarm bells rang. The victim's relatives didn't hesitate. They went straight to the police. That decision turned the tide. The call provided just enough to work with. It gave officers a voice, a general area, and a rough time frame. Every available unit was mobilized. Surveillance analysts dug through phone data. Tactical firearms teams were briefed and placed on standby. Hours later, armed officers closed in on the Gorton lockup. What they found inside was grim. The victim, barely responsive, was curled in a corner, burn marks down his arm, bruising to his torso, dried blood on his clothes, but he was still breathing. He was lucky to be alive. 2 men, Ben Ukaigbu and John Bishop, were arrested without resistance, not a word between them. No explanations, no panic, just cold silence. That silence told investigators everything they needed to know. The scene inside spoke volumes too. Forensics moved quickly, bagging evidence before word could spread. A balaclava found in a kit bag tested positive for Delroy Chin's DNA. It didn't stop there. A warrant was executed at Chin's address, where detectives found another vehicle tracker and a pair of handcuffs. Not exactly everyday household items. Micah Wallfall, the gang's enforcer and the man responsible for most of the physical violence, had already left the country. But his escape plan was sloppy. He fled to Spain, thinking he'd bought himself time. He hadn't. Detectives flagged his details with international partners, and within months, Wallfall was arrested abroad and flown back to the UK under escort. Meanwhile, the full story began to unfold. Sean Freeman, once a trusted friend of the victim, emerged as a central figure. He had saved the victim's number plate in his phone. He had compiled names of family members. He'd even shared a meal with him at Nando's, giving Chin the perfect opportunity to attach the tracker. Every action had been calculated, every move rehearsed. The arrests didn't slow. And with each new piece of evidence, the gang's web of secrecy started to unravel. Each member of the gang had a defined role, and together they formed a tight, calculated unit. Their actions weren't chaotic. They were deliberate, rehearsed, and rooted in experience. This wasn't a group of strangers thrown together overnight. These were individuals with criminal backgrounds, shared motives, and a willingness to cross any line for money. They operated like a crew with a plan, not a mob chasing impulse. Each move had been thought out. Each task assigned. Micah Wallfall was the muscle. He wasn't just present, he was central to the violence. It was Wallfall who delivered the most extreme parts of the assault. He used a taser to torture the victim, aimed a blowtorch at his arm, and held a realistic imitation firearm to his head. His job was to break the man mentally and physically, and he carried it out with disturbing precision. When police raided the lockup, Wallfall wasn't there. He'd already fled the country, escaping to Spain in the days that followed, but it wasn't a clean getaway. He was tracked down, arrested abroad, and extradited back to the UK to face justice. He received a sentence of 11 years and 3 months. Sean Freeman's role was less violent, but just as vital. He was the insider, the friendly face who turned. A trusted acquaintance of the victim, Freeman used regular contact to gain intel. They played football together, met socially. It was Freeman who recorded number plates, gathered the names of family members, and quietly observed routines. Most importantly, he was the one who lured the victim to the Pars Wood Centre in Didsbury under the guise of a casual meal. That meeting gave Delroy Chin the window he needed to attach the tracker to the car. For his betrayal, Freeman was sentenced to 9 years. Delroy Chin was the technician. He handled the surveillance side of the operation, fitting the tracker, managing movement, and staying embedded in the logistics. His DNA was later found on a balaclava recovered from the lockup, and a search of his home uncovered more evidence, a second tracker and a set of handcuffs. Chin was handed 11 years behind bars. Supporting the core team were 5 more men: Nicky Barnes, Daniel Lowe, Michael Ituhu, John Bishop, and Ben Ukegbu, each convicted for conspiracy to kidnap and blackmail. Their sentences ranged from 7 to 12 years. Etuhu, once a football agent, was described as the facilitator, a man with the contacts and calmness to keep the operation running smoothly. He was sentenced to 10 years and 2 months. In the courtroom, the scale and planning behind the operation left little room for sympathy. Judge Hilary Manley didn't mince words. She described the plot as a sophisticated, well-prepared criminal enterprise, meticulously arranged, ruthlessly executed. The gang's coordination may have impressed on paper, but the cruelty at its heart revealed everything about their true intent. Each member played a part in a scheme driven by greed and power. They believed the victim wouldn't speak, that his background would keep him silent, but they misjudged both him and his family. The moment ransom calls were made, the victim's relatives turned to the police, setting in motion a swift, multi-force investigation that would pull the gang's entire operation apart. Detective Sergeant Mark Evans spoke after sentencing, saying, "This was a lengthy investigation involving painstaking work by multiple teams, and today, every single one of these individuals is behind bars." The fallout rippled through Manchester's underworld. A message had been sent. No matter how calculated, no matter how bold, crime like this couldn't survive the weight of police pressure and determined victims. The gang's plan was brutal, but the response was methodical. And in the end, justice caught up with them, loudly, completely, and without mercy. The gang believed they had the perfect plan: target someone from their own world, someone unlikely to call the police, and use fear to squeeze £500,000 out of him. Every step was calculated. From the fake arrest to the choice of location, the tracking devices to the torture tools, they'd covered their bases. Or so they thought. But greed has a way of blinding even the most strategic minds. They overlooked one crucial factor. Desperation cuts both ways. While they were busy terrorizing the victim, his family was already speaking to police. Every call, every demand, every movement was pulling the noose tighter around them. What followed was one of the most intense investigations Greater Manchester Police had faced in recent years. Arrests across cities, extraditions from abroad. Every name on the list ticked off until there was no one left standing. This case wasn't about justice for an innocent man. It was about drawing the line, showing that no matter someone's background, no one deserves to be kidnapped, tortured, and used as leverage for profit. The gang may have believed their world operated by its own rules, but the law caught up. And in the end, every last one of them paid the price.